All right, welcome everybody. This is the Summer Orchard Pruning and Growing Cane Fruit class. I'm Dean Gunderson, the Director of Education, and we will get started here. So first, with all of my pruning classes, if you've been to any of my other pruning classes, you know I like to make this distinction. First thing is that pruning is the cutting of branches or, shoots or whatever, but it's the cutting of the above ground plant. But pruning is just one tactic for training trees. So training is the actual goal. You're trying to get the tree to do something, and pruning is just one way to do that. However, there are other ways to do that. So we'll talk about that a little bit today, because those other ways in kind of a backyard orchard or a community orchard, those other ways often make more sense. And then you do pruning to basically get rid of the excess, whereas pruning is used as really the only training technique in a lot of larger plantings because it's the fastest way to do things. So then why do we train trees or prune trees, which is again just a technique of training? We do it in order to create strong structure, which is really important with fruit trees. These trees are not only have to live up to the normal stresses of life and wind and storms and everything, but they have to do that while also holding several hundred pounds of fruit in some instances. And so you really want a nice strong structure on these trees so that when they're ripening all of this fruit, and particularly if a big storm comes in while they're trying to do that, they're strong enough that you're not going to have limb failure or the whole tree just kind of tip over. We also do it to increase light penetration and increase airflow. So we want to make the tree more open so that more light and air can get into the center of the crown or to the center of the plant. And one of the reasons we do that is to reduce humidity, because reducing humidity in the plants can really help control disease, because some of the most problematic diseases here in the Eastern US are fungal based. And so humidity is something that can help or hurt you in that endeavor of reducing fungal issues. The high humidity, they tend to grow and survive much more happily than in lower humidity. So getting higher light and airflow helps to control that. Doing this training also helps to actually improve fruit quality by reducing disease and also reducing pest pressure to some extent, because dark, humid areas are places that are much more comfortable for a lot of these pest insects than blazing sun and low humidity. It can also help increase the quantity of fruit, which might seem a little counterintuitive, that if you cut half the branches off, you'd think you'd have half as much fruit, but it's actually the opposite, because most fruit trees, almost all, will only produce fruit on branches that are receiving close to full sun. So if you have a tree that's pretty dense, the only place you're going to get fruit is on the outer tips of the branches. Versus if you have that same tree, but you've removed a bunch of the branches so that light can get into the middle, you'll get fruit in there as well as on the end of the branches. So you actually get more fruit with less branches if you train or prune appropriately. And it can also increase the frequency of fruit production. This is particularly the case with apples. So apples are a bit notorious for going into what's called an alternate bearing cycle, which is a thing that can happen, particularly if they're not pruned. So if apple trees are not pruned, particularly for a long period of time, they can go into this cycle where they will produce huge amounts of fruit one year and virtually no fruit the next year, and then huge amounts of fruit the third year, and then virtually no fruit the fourth year, and just cycle back and forth. And wild apples and crab apples do this naturally as an adaptation to reduce pest pressure, because the pests don't have anything to eat half the year, and so it helps keep the populations lower, so that then that next year when they produce huge amounts of fruit, there's hopefully not enough pests to destroy all of the crop. But if you're wanting apples every single year, having a huge amount one year, too many to use, and then none the next year, probably not something you're excited about. Pruning and training can also be really helpful in controlling size, which can be particularly important if you're in an urban or suburban area where you're trying to keep plants smaller than maybe they naturally want to be, so that they fit into the space that you have available. And kind of in the same vein, it can help control vigor. So some fruit trees, I mean fruit trees in general, but some like peaches in particular can grow just incredibly quickly. And so pruning and training can help kind of slow down that growth so that you get, again, stronger branches, and you don't get overgrowth. You don't end up with just really dense tangle of a tree, which again, we don't want, because we want maximum airflow and humidity and all of those things. So if you've read much about fruit trees, or you have experience with fruit trees, or you've been to one of our classes before, you are probably thinking that you are supposed to prune in the winter or like the early spring, dormant pruning, and that is definitely the time that you are doing most of your pruning. But we also like to prune in the summer. There's much less pruning that you're doing in the summer, but it is helpful to do that for a couple of reasons. One, we do it to maintain the structure that you created during that dormant pruning. We also do it to clean up regrowth from dormant pruning. So trees like apples and Asian pears and European pears in particular, when you cut a branch in the dormant season, it can sometimes lead to pretty vigorous water sprouts coming off of that cut. And so this is a great time to remove those water sprouts. And cutting them now helps kind of stifle any additional regrowth from that cut. Versus if you waited until the next dormant season and cut it, you would continue to get vigorous regrowth for a while. It can also help you direct new growth toward your desired structure. So if you're cutting off this growth that you don't want, it helps kind of continue to funnel the energy of the tree towards those branches that you do want, to help stifle growth. So again, this would be, if you have really vigorous trees, or just if you don't want the tree to get any bigger, like this is the time that you're going to be cutting or kind of like topping, which is not, I don't really like that word because it's usually affiliated with some pretty poor pruning techniques, but like topping of a tree, like kind of, setting the height limit. This is the time to do the pruning to do that, or to bring the height down of a tree. Trying to do that in the dormant season is going to usually lead to pretty intense regrowth, which kind of defeats the purpose. And so this is the time to do that, because pruning in the summer helps to stifle growth, whereas pruning in the dormant season helps to trigger additional growth. So it's a complement to your dormant pruning. So then what are we training to? The same thing that we're training to in the dormant season. There's three main structures for trees. There's the central leader, the modified central leader, and the open base or open center. And those three structures are similar to each other, but each a little different. So the similarities are that they all start with a trunk that's usually clear for about 3 feet, ideally, and then you have your first ring of branches, at least 3 feet off the ground. If you have branches lower than that, you start running into difficulty mowing under it, weeding under it, mulching under it. And also when you get fruit on those branches below 3 feet, you start running into problems of the branches being pretty close to the ground or even being on the ground when they're under the weight of fruit. So they all start ideally about 3 feet off the ground. And then you have kind of a scaffold ring. So a scaffold ring is ideally, you have branches that kind of point out in different directions, usually like 3 to 5 branches that, hopefully you're not going to have, 4 branches all on one half of the tree. If the trunk's over here and you got 4 branches over here, that's not ideal. You want, like one pointing in each cardinal direction. Obviously, you're not going to have them exactly like that, but kind of, pointing in opposite directions, having a relatively balanced shape, all relatively close to each other on the trunk, about 3 feet off the ground. Again, you're not going to get exactly that, but that's kind of what you're aiming for. So the first one, central leader, is probably the most common structure that you will be dealing with. And that's the structure that you're going to be pruning and training towards for your fruit trees like apples, European pears, Asian pears, pawpaws, European plums, and even some others. Sometimes cherries sometimes are more central leader, sometimes they're more modified central leader. There's a little bit of flexibility in these structures, but these are the ones that you are pretty much going to be doing central leader. So like we talked about, you're going to have 3 feet and then your first scaffold ring. In a central leader, you're then going to ideally have about another 2-ish feet, 16 or 18 inches to 2 feet of clear trunk, and then another scaffold ring, and then another 2 feet, and then another scaffold ring, and then another 2 feet, and just until you kind of get to whatever height your tree is growing towards. And that gap in between those scaffold rings, again, really helps with light and air penetration. So, if you look, I'm pretty sure you can see my cursor. With this gap, you think if like the sun is up here at this angle, in like the fall, that light can like come in and basically hit all the way back to the trunk. Versus if you had a branch halfway here, that light is really only going to be hitting kind of the tips of those branches, kind of at that same angle. So it again just helps get that light deep into the canopy of the tree, which means that you can potentially get fruit all the way along these branches, from the trunk all the way to the tip of the branch, which is what you want. So kind of on the opposite side, you have open vase. So open vase is really the pruning technique that is used to control vigor. So this is the one that you're using on very vigorously growing trees that don't have that really dominant central leader. So here in St. Louis, that's really peaches and nectarines, because nectarines are peaches. They're just peaches without fuzz. So they grow very similarly. They're literally the same species, and they're very, very vigorous. Apricots and non-European plums are also pruned to this shape sometimes. Apricots, I don't think really need to be trained that way here, at least in my experience. Plums can benefit from that, but I've also seen people do more modified central leader on plums, and it also work. But peaches and nectarines really should be open vase here. And so what open vase looks like is, again, you've got that 3-foot clear trunk, and then you've got your first ring of scaffold branches, and then nothing else. There's nothing about that. You cut the tree off after that first scaffold ring. And this is an image of a real peach tree that has that shape, and you can see it pretty clearly on this image, where you can see there's the trunk, there's these main kind of scaffold branches, and then you can see kind of these side branches that are also pretty thick. And then you see, after that thickness, it's just these little wispy branches. So just to show you how vigorous peach trees can be, all of these little wispy branches on here, all of them that you see, that's 1 year. That's 1 year growth. And so, if you're thinking, we need to pick peaches, and peaches are pretty soft, you don't want to be, usually knocking them off the tree and picking them up off the ground, or trying to get them with that like wire basket on a stick thing, because that usually bruises them. You really need to be picking them by hand, which means you need to be able to reach them from the ground or from a ladder. And so although this might look relatively short, if you're thinking you got branches that are up here in 1 year, with a ladder, this is really as tall as you can manage. So that's why we do that shape for peaches. And because there's nothing above that first scaffold ring, all of these branches are getting maximum sun and airflow. And peaches have some fungal diseases that are very difficult to control, particularly organically. And so again, this structure helps to reduce the humidity in here and to get that sun in, which helps kill off fungal pathogens. And so that's why we do this structure for peaches and nectarines in particular. So then modified central leader is kind of like a middle ground between central leader and open vase. So these are things that are more like moderately vertical growers, moderately vertical vigor. It's not a peach, but it's not like an apple where it just wants to shoot straight up to the sky. And as I said, not like an apple. There are some apple cultivars that do a little bit better as modified central leader, and you can usually tell because they just won't really grow that straight. They just kind of will flop over and do their thing and just aren't very vigorous growers. Some pears, although not many. Really, there's some apples. The main ones though that I see people particularly training toward modified central leader is persimmons and cherries. And what modified central leader is is again, it's kind of halfway. So you've got kind of some scaffold rings, maybe another one, and then really nothing after that. Oftentimes I won't see people kind of cut this. It's more just kind of like the central leader just kind of peters out and will just kind of go over and do its thing. And there's just nothing real vigorous trying to take over, which is often what happens if you have an apple that, shoots up and the central leader kind of flops over, another branch will just take over and shoot up. Whereas these things like persimmons and cherries, usually they just kind of reach a point where they're just like, nah, and they just kind of stop growing that way. But you can cut off the top to kind of top it, but keep it to keep it a little shorter for you, like to do the modified central leader. And that's one of the reasons why sometimes people do that with cherries, is because cherries are a lot of work to pick. And so keeping it a little shorter can be desirable. So branch angle is another really important part of structure. So, you're thinking like, oh, we're like working toward these structures, but the angle of the branches is really critical to working toward that structure. So what I mean by that is, you got the trunk, you got a branch, like what is this angle? So we don't want it real narrow. We want it at least 45 degrees. So often what you'll hear is like 45 to 60 degrees. I usually say 45 to 90 degrees because 90 degrees is also fine and it's much easier to conceptualize. And so that wider shape is really helpful for creating really strong branch unions on the tree. And as an illustration of this, you can see this branch here on the left, which has that nice, 45 to 60 degree angle here. And if you cut that branch vertically, this is what it looks like on the inside. You can see, it's got that nice, kind of cream colored wood, all the way through. This is like fully fused wood. That connection is as solid as it's going to get. Whereas if you look at this branch over here, where the angle here of this junction is pretty narrow, when you cut that vertically, you see this dark patch here going down the middle. So what that dark kind of strip is that's the bark. So as the tree is growing, as that trunk and that branch have gotten thicker, it hasn't been able to push the bark out because the angle is too small. And so that bark gets pinched in between there, which means that this isn't really fully fused, which means that although this branch is getting bigger and heavier over time, the actual connection holding it to the tree is not getting stronger at the same rate that this is getting heavier. And so eventually this is going to get heavy enough, or enough force will be put on it by wind or an animal or something, that it's just going to split and break. And I can almost guarantee that you have all seen this, although maybe I'm sure there's one or two of you who haven't. But when Bradford pears encounter a light breeze, this is what happens. And the reason for that is not that their wood is overly weak, it's that their branch junctions are overly weak. And that's because they grow like this. The branches just grow straight up, very narrow angles. And so you can see, like on this picture on the right, all of this dark color in there, that's all that bark that's been like pinched as it goes, and then it kind of rots, or little insects get in there and start eating it. And when you get a storm, the weight, it splits, and it will like strip kind of the whole trunk. And like you can see like here on the left, and then your tree's dead. I mean, you don't have any tree left. And so you really want those nice wide branch angles on your tree, like you would see if you're driving out across the plains and you see a tree standing off on its own, no other trees around, in areas that get really intense storms and tornadoes and stuff, and the tree looks 200 years old. You're like, how the heck has this survived? We look at it, it doesn't look like a Bradford pear. It's got big wide branch angles, which help keep it alive, help keep it from breaking. So how do you actually create that structure? Just because you want a wide branch doesn't mean the tree is going to grow that way, but you can bend them and hold them in place until they start growing in that shape that you're after. So there's quite a few different ways to do this. This is the way that we primarily do it, which was we buy these limb spreaders. So they're just little plastic sticks that have a V on the end and then a little like spike kind of in the middle of that V. And so what you do is, when you have a branch, you pull it down and you stick that that V onto that branch, and the spike in the middle of that V sticks into the branch and holds it in place. And then you push that branch down to whatever angle you want, and then you wedge the other side of that limb spreader up against the trunk. And again, that little spike sticks into the bark of the trunk, and it locks that branch, that limb, in that angle that you want. And if you do that, especially if you do it in the dormant season, you can take that off usually in a couple months, because the branch is growing vigorously in the spring, early summer, and that growth is that ring of growth on wood. Well, if it's putting that ring of growth in this shape where it's bent down, it's going to be locked into that shape, because that's now the shape of the wood that it put on. And so if you do it now, though, you'd have to wait a little bit longer. So if you put one on now, you'd probably have to wait until next spring before it would stay in place. But if you take it out and the branch bends back, just put it back in. Like you don't have to. It's not like if you pull it out, you're like, oh no, I messed up. Like, just redo it. It's not going to hurt anything. But you don't have to buy those limb spreaders. You can do this a lot of other ways. So you can see where some people just like take some wood and they just cut little notches in them, do kind of the same thing. You can use just a big stiff piece of wire, like this little drawing here shows it. Or you can just take like a string or a rope or a wire and tie like a lighter branch to a lower branch if that lower branch is secure. Or you can wrap around a branch and pull it down and stake the other end to hold it in place, or tie it to a cinder block or a brick or something that like sits on the ground to hold down the branch to whatever angle you want it at. The only thing I usually do not recommend is hanging weights from branches. Some people recommend that, and it probably works, but it always makes me nervous because you've got that like dangling weight, and especially if we have a storm, kind of that like whiplash motion that can happen with that dangling weight if you have especially a really thin branch in particular. I'm just always worried about that, like breaking a branch, or just also like the rubbing that can happen with that weight as it swings around. It can rub on the bark and damage the bark. So I usually don't recommend that, but I have seen people do it successfully. So another key thing that you can do to create structure is if you're trying to maintain your central leader, like if you're trying to make it nice and straight on your apple or your pawpaw or a jujube, if you're wanting to grow those things that want a nice central leader, or any nut tree, well, other than an almond, any other nut tree, then bamboo poles is what I really like. They work really well for it. So if you have a tree, you imagine it, you've got the trunk that's going nice and straight, and then if the central leader starts kind of like drooping over or drifting over in a direction that you don't want it, and you want to figure out like, how do I straighten this up, then if you take a bamboo pole, which is straight, a bamboo pole doesn't really bend, it's either straight or it breaks. So you hold a bamboo pole, and you want one that's thick enough that it's gonna be able to do this. So you don't want like a real tiny little one if you're gonna try and stake a big tree. But if it starts drifting over, what you do is you take that bamboo pole and you lash it, or you tie it to the trunk, and then you pull the central leader that's flopping over up, and then tie it to that bamboo pole. And because the bamboo is tied to the trunk that is already straight, it's not gonna bend over anymore. It's gonna hold that in place, just like you see in this image here on the right. And then just like the limb spreader, if you leave that on for like a year, by the time you take it off, it's gonna be growing nice and straight. And then you get to the pruning. So once you kind of figure out like the shape, making sure your shape is right, you do any bending you need to do, make sure the central leader is going straight. Then if you've got other branches that you need to remove, that's when you're actually talking about removing branches through pruning. So when to summer prune? So summer pruning you really want to do in late July to August. So not this weekend, but I like to teach it early, so people have time to get ready. So late July to August. If you do it earlier than that, it can lead to new growth, which kind of defeats the purpose. If you're trying to like cut off excess growth now, and then you do it too early, and so then there's more growth, you're gonna have to come back and cut it again. So I usually like to wait till late July or August. You want to do it during a dry spell. So if it's supposed to rain all week, it's not ideal to go out and do it then. because wet weather can lead to disease, the proliferation of disease when you're like opening up fresh wounds on the tree through cuts. And hot, dry weather, which is usually what we have in late July and August, can lead to what's called summer dormancy. So when the temperature gets really high, especially when water is scarce, trees will, for the most part, kind of shut down photosynthesis, and they'll just kind of go into like a maintenance state. And so cutting at that time is less stressful to them. And it's also, again, less likely to cause new growth to emerge from those cuts, which we don't want if we're doing summer pruning. So what tools are you going to need? Almost all of the pruning that you're going to do is just going to be with a hand pruner. So that's, this one up here. And I would recommend to do this type of pruner, the ones that are kind of like a scissors, like bypass pruner is what it's called, as opposed to an anvil pruner. So an anvil pruner is the one where you have kind of like a flat plate and then a blade that just kind of slams against that flat plate. I would not recommend those. If you're able to get bypass pruners, do that. They make a cleaner cut. They do less damage to the plant. They're easier to maintain in the long term. Anvil pruners, like you can't really like sharpen them because then they don't hit the anvil quite right and they don't make a full cut and it is a mess. So bypass hand pruners are worth it. You might need a loppers. Although there are some hand pruners that are like heavy duty enough that they can really do everything a loppers would do as well. But most people are going to want a loppers if you have kind of medium sized branches, like an inch or more in diameter, depending on what type of hand pruners you have, because different ones can handle different thicknesses of branches. And again, with the loppers, I would recommend a bypass like this picture here, as opposed to an anvil type loppers. And then if you're going to be doing any large cuts, like especially if you have trees that maybe have never been pruned or have been neglected for a long time and they've got big old branches that need to come off, I would highly recommend doing a pruning saw. So you can use, I guess you could use a chainsaw, but I guess you could use like a bow saw or like other saws like that. But I will tell you, it is worth the money. And there's some that are just really not that expensive that still work well to get a pruning saw. They're also sometimes called limbing saws, like L-I-M-B, like the limb of a tree. And they're designed specifically for cutting branches on trees, and they're well worth it. As a left-handed person, I can tell you a lot of saws do not work well if you are left-handed, but limbing saws still work okay left-handed, and they're really easy to use right-handed even as a lefty, whereas some other saws are not nice to left-handed people. You're also going to want some rubbing alcohol and some rags, which is because of sanitation. So when you're pruning a branch, you are opening a wound to the tree. And so you want it to be sanitary. Just like, if you cut yourself, you want to clean out the wound. So you want these cutting surfaces to be sanitary, because if you have a pathogen on the blade of the pruners, and then you go to a tree and you make that cut, you've just potentially introduced that pathogen to an open wound on the tree. So all cutting edges, particularly your hand pruners and your loppers, should be sanitized anytime you are moving between trees or shrubs or whatever you're pruning. So this is again to prevent disease from moving from one tree to the other, because you might have a tree that has a disease and the one next to it might not have one yet or might not have it. And so you don't want to be spreading it from one tree to the other. And you might not know it has a disease. It might not actually be infected by the disease, but it might be on the plant. It might be on the bark or on the leaves, or just there. And so it's just best practice to anytime you're moving to a new tree to wipe off the cutting surfaces. And so the way that I like to do that is with rubbing alcohol, dump it onto a rag, and then just wipe the blades down with that rag, which will sanitize it. You can also use a diluted bleach solution or iodine. I just prefer alcohol because I don't need to worry about the iodine staining me or the bleaching my clothes. alcohol just doesn't have those same problems. And so so I prefer alcohol, but you can use a diluted bleach or an iodine solution as well. It's also, do I have that on there? Yeah. So if you have a disease on the tree, like an active disease that you are trying to remove, like if you see fire blight on your tree, which we'll talk about in a couple slides, but like if you have fire blight on your tree and you're like cutting a branch with fire blight off the tree, you should sanitize that cutting surface before you make any more cuts, whether it's on the same tree or not. And that's the case, if you're cutting several branches off the same tree, all with fire blight, it's annoying, but it's best to, with each cut that you're sanitizing to help prevent that spread, because fire blight, the only way to remove fire blight is to cut out the damaged tissue. So if you make a cut to remove the damaged tissue, but in that cut, you just introduce fire blight again, it means you're just going to have to continue to cut and cut and cut and cut and cut until you don't have a tree left. And then prunings should be removed from the orchard as well, which is another basic kind of sanitation practice. So any cuts that you're making, any branches that you're removing from the tree, you shouldn't just cut them and just leave them laying under your tree and just rot there, because again, that branch could have a disease on it. It could have an insect on it. It could have an insect egg on it. You just don't know. And so it's best to either put those in a yard waste dumpster, burn them, chip them up, or at least move them out of the orchard and away from the orchard. So then what does summer prune? What are you actually cutting in the summer? So the first thing I say is that you're going to do what I kind of call cleanup pruning of all your plants. So there's just certain things that all of your plants you're gonna look for, remove those things if it needs to be done. And then there's some that you're going to be doing like a full like summer pruning, and that's your apples, your Asian pears, your young European pears, so your European pears that are not yet to full size, and then your cane fruit, the flora cane we'll talk about, but your cane fruits. And then I'm increasingly recommending doing just your full pruning of European pears during this time of year. So like checking everything that you would in the dormant season, but doing it now for your European pears once they're mature. And that I'm not really going to go into what the full pruning is, because it's a whole hour-long class that I teach in the dormant season. But you can find that on our YouTube, and it's everything that we're going to talk about today, plus just a couple more things that you're checking for. So cleanup pruning. So again, this is what you're going to be doing to all of your trees that are grafted. Or sorry, for all of your trees that are grafted, you're going to be removing root suckers. So trees that are grafted, which is again almost all the fruit trees that you're going to be growing. I mean, honestly, probably all of the fruit trees you're going to be growing. Apples, pears, persimmons, almost all pawpaws, jujubes, apricots, plums, pecans, chestnuts. I mean, really all of them are grafted in the tree realm. And what that means is that there's a rootstock, which is genetically one tree, and then you take a branch from a tree that you like the fruit of, or you like the disease resistance of the leaves or whatever, and you stick that onto the root, and they are genetically two separate trees. Usually it's the same species. So like if we're talking about an apple, like they're both apples, but they're genetically two different individuals. But when you stick them together, when you do it correctly, they grow together and become one like functional organism, even though they have two separate, DNA codes. And you can see that on younger trees by this. You see this kind of like dog leg, or this kind of swelling on the tree, and that's that graft union. So that's where those two pieces were stuck together. So there's a lot of reasons that we do that. It's very, very helpful and nice. It allows us to grow things that wouldn't normally like our soil in our soil, because you can stick a different root on it that is more adapted to our soil, or is resistant to a certain fungal disease in the soil, or is resistant to a certain pathogenic nematode, or there's lots of different reasons that we do that. But because they are two separate individuals, the rootstock will, especially when it's young, will try to send up shoots of its own, particularly in apples and Asian pears, but it can happen in any grafted tree. And so for all of those trees, you don't want the rootstock to have leaves. That's why it's a rootstock. If you wanted it on the top, it would have been on the top. And so like if you let this grow, if it's an apple, it might produce apples, but it's not going to be the apple you wanted. It's probably not going to taste very good, because if it tasted very good, we'd be growing it as the top of an apple. And it potentially isn't resistant to diseases. So like apples, often like for the varieties that we pick the top for fire blight resistance is one of the things we select it for. Well, the rootstock, fire blight isn't really an issue for the rootstock. And so we're not selecting for fire blight resistance on the rootstock. But if you let the rootstock grow and you let these branches grow, this branch could get fire blight, and then it could shoot right down and kill the whole tree to the roots because it wasn't resistant, because it's not supposed to have leaves. And so when you see these root suckers, you want to remove them. There's no reason to keep them. There's no benefit to keeping them. You just want to remove them. And this is a good time when you're summer pruning, if you see any of those, to remove them. I always say to just cut them to the ground surface. Some people will tell you to like dig them up or try and get them below soil level. You can do that. I always just don't think it's really worth that effort because it's, one, a lot of work, but also doing that is disturbing the roots, and we like the roots. And so we just don't want the leaves. And so just cut it at ground surface is what I tell people. So also for cleanup pruning, so again, this is what you're gonna be doing this to all of your trees, grafted or not, but all of your trees, is you wanna remove any broken, damaged, or diseased branches. You wanna remove all of these. So broken, like if your branch is broken, if it broke in a storm or you hit it with a car or something, remove that branch. It's not gonna fix itself. It's not gonna heal itself. Trees can't regrow a limb in the way that we can like heal a bone. It just doesn't work that way. And so if this branch is broken, cut it off. Just cut your losses, get rid of it, give the tree more time to regrow a new branch for you. So get rid of any of those. It's also all of that like broken area is a potentially is a potential spot for infection, an opening for a disease to get in. Also, if you have, again, any noticeable disease on the tree, so fire blight is the big one that you want to make sure to look out for. So this can impact your apples, your pears, both European and Asian. It can attack service berries, although it's pretty rare that it attacks service berries. And it can actually attack Japanese plums, which doesn't even make sense, but it can. There's like documented proof of it, and I have seen it in St. Louis. And so like it is possible, even though it doesn't make sense. So, but for the most part, you're going to be checking your apples and your pears for fire blight. And what it looks like is it will often start where like the flowers or the young fruit is, and then the leaves kind of around that, or it will start at the tip of a vigorously growing branch. And it will often, again, like the leaves or whatever on the ends will start turning black, and it will kind of start working its way down basically toward the root. So like if it's at the tip of a branch, it will start at the tip of the branch and start working its way down. If it's on, a little flower thing, it'll kill the flower and all the little leaves around it, and then eventually go into this branch and then start spreading along this branch in kind of both directions, but primarily toward the trunk. And when it gets to wood, to a branch or a trunk, it looks like somebody lit the tree on fire. It looks burnt, which is why it's called fire blight. And you want to remove that. You want to cut that out, and you want to cut it out about 6 inches below where it looks like it stopped, because it kills the inside of the branch, and then it takes a little bit for the bark to express that. And so if you cut it right here, you didn't get it. So you want to cut it about 6 inches back, and then look at the branch where you cut it. And if it's got a green ring on it, you got everything, you're good, nothing left to do. If you look at it though, and there's no green, if it's brown or black kind of under the bark, then you didn't get it all. You want to sanitize your pruners and then go back another 6 inches or so, make another cut, and repeat. You also want to remove any competing central leaders. This is again for all trees, although really this is more for your apples and your pears at this point. So those things that you're going to be doing just the summer pruning for. So your apples, European pears, and Asian pears. If you have a competing leader, which is where, if you've got this central leader that you want up here, but then you get a branch doing this, or like this over here, where, this is probably your central leader, but this one kind of popped up and is kind of wanting to grow there. You either want to bend this one that you don't want down so that it becomes a scaffold branch, if you need a scaffold branch there, or cut it off. This is also, again, for your apples, your European pears, and your Asian pears only. So this is like the full summer pruning. You want to remove any water sprouts. So water sprouts are just very vigorous, upright growth. They will not have fruit on them. They usually grow in just like a year. Like a lot of these water sprouts you're going to find are going to be like from the dormant season cuttings, like a response to that. They'll often come from the cuts that you did in the spring. And European pears are particularly aggressive at producing water sprouts as a response to spring pruning, which is why I'm recommending more that people do more pruning in the summer than in the spring for mature European pears. So, and here we go. So for European pears, for the young ones, do everything we just talked about. Everything we just talked about. But once your European pear gets to like your mature size, at which point hopefully you have like established the structure and got it to do roughly what you want, then I would recommend that you can do some pruning in the dormant season, but that you really do most of your pruning now. So not just like, oh, let's remove some water sprouts, but like if there are some larger cuts that you need to do pretty much as you can of that in the summer to help stifle that growth, because European pears can have, again, really aggressive regrowth. And the problem with that, other than you don't want all of those water sprouts, is that water sprouts, because they're so vigorous, are particularly susceptible to infection from fire blight, which is not fun to deal with. So yeah. And then bringing down height. So if you have a tree that is too tall, or you've decided this is as tall as I want it, and you want to keep it that size, then this is when you do the pruning to maintain that height. This is when you're like, oh, let's cut off the top foot because I really want to keep it at like this height. You do that now. You don't do that in the dormant season, because if you do that in the dormant season, again, you're going to get a lot of vigorous regrowth from that cut, and it's just going to continue to grow. Whereas if you cut it now, it's going to help kind of stifle that regrowth and help maintain that shorter height that you want. So that I mean, this tree is very short already, but like just as an example of what this guy's doing, if you decide, oh, this is as high as I want it, then cut those branches, cut them kind of at the height that you want, and then but know that you're gonna have to continue to make those cuts. The tree is going to continue to want to grow to that mature size, but you're going to have less aggressive regrowth by doing that pruning now. And always, just a little caveat too, when we're talking about keeping trees shorter, if you've got a 40-foot apple tree that's like already 40 feet tall, and you're like, man, it'd be nice if it was 10 feet tall, it's going to be real hard to bring it down to 10 feet tall. It's going to be much easier to get it to 30 feet tall than it is to get it to 10 feet tall. Versus if you have an apple tree that is only naturally 15 feet tall, and you're like, I want it to be 10 feet tall, that's very doable. So, you need to just have some realistic expectations of how much you can bring that height down. And it's also much easier, if you have a 40-foot tall apple tree, or a tree that wants to get 40 feet tall, and you start pruning it when it's young to maintain it at 10 feet, that's going to be much more feasible than if the tree is already 40 feet and try and bring it down to that. So it's just, you gotta kind of have some realistic expectations when it comes to like dwarfing trees through pruning. The more that you're fighting against what the tree wants to do, it's just the more work that you're going to have for yourself. Doable, but is it worth it is kind of the question. Okay, so cane fruits. So what are cane fruit? So cane fruit is essentially blackberry, raspberry, black raspberry, and their various hybrids. So there's lots of other kind of cane fruit that are hybrids of blackberry and raspberry, or hybrids of a hybrid of blackberry and raspberry and a blackberry, or a hybrid of a blackberry and raspberry and a raspberry, or a hybrid of a blackberry and a raspberry and a hybrid of a blackberry and a raspberry. Like, there's been crazy amounts of breeding that have been done to create things like boysenberries and marionberries and, you know, lots of different cane fruits. But they all have kind of some similar things in common, and they're pretty unique plants because they have perennial roots, just like a tree or like you know, like a lawn grass or something like that. But unlike those things, they don't have a top that lasts for decades like a tree, and they don't have a top that only lasts for 1 year like grass. They have tops that last for exactly 2 years. So those are biennial tops. And so those tops, which are like branches that come up and will live for 2 years and then die, are called canes. So that's why they're called cane fruits, is because they're fruit that grows on canes. So this picture over here is black raspberry, which I always just like to show because it is not a blackberry. It's a raspberry, but it's black in color, but it is not the same. Like when you buy like a red raspberry or a yellow raspberry or like a gold raspberry, those are all actually the red raspberry species. But the black raspberry is a completely different species, has a different flavor, very good, and it's a native. And it is delicious if you've never had it. Highly recommend it. So the reason that, or I don't know if it's the reason, but you know, you have these canes that live for 2 years, and so we have 2 different names for those. So when the cane first grows up, that first year, like if you have one that grew up this spring or summer, that cane is called a prima cane. So prime, first, is that like how I like to remember it? Like prime, the first one, it's the first year growth. So they do not fruit. They do not produce flowers. They are just leafy vegetation that first year. That prima cane will overwinter. It will usually stay green throughout the winter in our climate. And then that second year, that same cane is called a flora cane. And in that second year, that flora cane flowers. So flora, flower. And because it's flowering, it's producing fruit. So what that means is that you have to get that prima cane through to the second year to get fruit. If you cut them down every year, you're not going to get fruit for most of them. And after that second year, so that cane, you know, on that second year flowers, produces fruit, and then it dies in that next winter. And that's why, you know, if you see like wild blackberries or untended blackberries or raspberries, they're called, you know, brambles. They get full of all that thick, thorny, dead stuff. It's because each cane only lives for 2 years, and if somebody isn't there to cut it and remove it, or there are fires coming through, it just builds up, and you get this tangled mass of awfulness. So that's why pruning is important, so that you don't end up with that, so that you can actually get in and pick your fruit. But it has a very important biological reason. But not when you're trying to harvest fruit. However, there's always exceptions to rules. There are some cultivars now that have been identified. They're naturally occurring that are prima cane bearers. So some individuals have, you know, just through the rolling of genetic dice, are able to produce flowers and fruit on both the prima cane, the first year, and again on that cane second year. So these are technically prima cane bearers, but they're often called everbearing or fall bearing. It's all the same thing. It all means that they produce flowers and fruit on both the first and second year growth. So raspberries have a lot of prima cane bearing cultivars. They were kind of the first ones identified, and so there's a lot of breeding that's been done on those. Heritage and Caroline are the 2 that we use the most, but there are many others out there. Blackberry is relatively new, that they've been able to find ones that are everbearing. And there's 2 cultivars that are called Prime Arc. There's Prime Arc 45 and Prime Arc Freedom, I believe, that are both prima cane bearing blackberries. They're also both thornless, which is very nice for blackberries. And then black raspberries, there's 2 that just like within the last 5 years, I think, have been identified as everbearing. And those are Ohio Treasure and Niwot, that are both everbearing. So for the everbearing ones, you have 2 different options. You can you can say, I don't want to deal with all the pruning and trellising and all of that, and I will just get the fruit off the primocanes, which means that you'll get that harvest in the fall, like usually August through frost. And I will just cut down everything in the winter, which is easier in terms, especially if it's a thorny one, because then you don't have to be dealing with pruning or trellising or messing with all the thorns. You just cut everything down in the winter. If, however, you want to get the fruit off of both the primocanes and the floricanes, then you're going to treat a primocane bear exactly like you would just a normal blackberry or raspberry, which is what we're going to talk about here in the last couple slides. So if you are growing a normal blackberry or raspberry, or you want your primocane bearing one to produce both crops, then you're going to need to do a couple things. You are going to want to have a trellis of some kind, or at least I highly recommend it, especially if they're thorny. There's lots of different trellises you can do. Some people just like to put them on fences. My preferred way to do it by far is what we call a T-trellis. So it's a trellis that's like this, that kind of looks like, an old clothesline at the top, where you've just got one wire going down each side of these two arms. So the reason that I like that is then, you plant them that first year on that trellis. The first year, all the growth that grows up is primocane. It's all first year branches. And then you can tie all of those onto this wire over here. And then the next year, you get a whole bunch more primocanes that come up, and you just tie them over here. And so then that second year, everything over here is going to produce fruit for you. And so then you can just walk down that side and harvest all the fruit. And then at the end of the year, all of these need to be cut, and you don't need to figure out like which one's a primocane, which one's a floricane. I don't know. All of them are over here, and you can just go down the line, cut. And then the third year, because you prune these off, you get your new primocanes come up and you tie them back over here, and then all your fruit's going to be over here. You can walk down the line, harvest them all, and then in the fall, winter, you can just come down, cut, and you just rotate back and forth, and it's much easier to keep track of. So I really like that type of trellis if you're doing a normal blackberry or raspberry, or you're wanting to get two crops off of your primocane bearers. The other thing you're going to want to do, which is more pruning, what we're talking about, is you're going to want to do what's called tip pruning. And that is where if you've grown blackberries in particular, you probably know that the cane, the branch, will just keep on growing. You can have a branch that's 10, 15 feet long, which is a mess to deal. I mean, it's difficult to deal with. It ends up being a big jumble. It's a tangle. And then when it comes to pruning, it's hard because that big long thing can be tangled up with other ones, and you're pulling it and it's breaking branches, and it's just not very fun. So what you can do, and what we like to do, is, especially with this type of trellis here, is whenever it gets to the height where it's tall enough to reach that wire, tie the branch or the cane to that wire, and then just cut the tip off, because then it's not going to grow any longer. And these things are like 5, 6-ish feet tall, so you're kind of like where it's pretty easy to be doing that kind of work, where you can see everything. If you're doing it on a fence or something, or however you're trellising it, just whatever height is convenient for you. Whenever you decide this is long enough, just cut the tip off of that cane. It will not kill the branch. What it will do is it will do this. It will trigger lateral branching. So if you can see like this main branch here that's growing up, you cut the tip off, and what that does is it then triggers side branches to start forming. And you can see 1, 2, 3. There's probably more down here, but I can't tell if that's on this one or the one back there. But at least 3 tips of branches, whereas before you had 1. So the reason that that's significant is that cane fruit will often produce fruit primarily or exclusively on the ends of branches. So if you've got a 15-foot long cane and you've only got 1 clump of branches at the end, or 1 clump of fruit at the end, that's all you get for that whole 15-foot thing. Whereas if you cut it at a convenient length for you, and then you get just even 3 side shoots, you've tripled the amount of fruit that you're getting from the same cane. And so and it just makes it's easier. They're bushier, they're easier to manage, it's easier to harvest. So that tip pruning is really critical. And that's another reason why we're doing this class a little early, is that this tip pruning you're probably going to be doing that like now. Like that's something that you're going to be doing now. And then a lot of the fruit trees you're going to be pruning in the upcoming weeks. So for cane fruit, that's really the main thing. And then in the winter, so in the time that you're doing the dormant pruning, you're going to go and cut out all those dead flora canes, or cut down everything if you're growing primocane bearing blackberries or raspberries. And that is summer pruning and cane fruits. But I'm happy to answer questions. I see there's a couple here, but feel free to throw more in if there's anything that I missed. Someone says they planted a dwarf peach tree this year and it doesn't seem to be thriving. We're watering, but not sure if it's too much. Keys to a young tree. I mean, it's hard to judge without a picture to see like what not thriving means. I would say just generally speaking, like dwarf peaches are just not real great. If it's like a patio peach, if that's what you're saying, patio peaches are just not great peaches. They just aren't real happy. But if it's a new tree, you know, I mean, you do want to water, especially in this extreme heat and dry periods that we have. Mulch is always critical for trees, always critical for trees. Just like wood chips are fine. Like you don't need to go like buy special mulch, but just like wood chips or something over the soil. And that's really the main thing, as long as your soil is appropriate for it. I mean, if it doesn't like the soil, it's just not going to be happy, but your soil's probably fine. Peaches are pretty adaptable as long as the soil isn't like standing water, which hopefully it's not. Do I have favorite varieties of dwarf trees for this area? No, I don't like dwarf trees. I mean, dwarf trees are fine. Generally speaking, though, so the dwarf nature of trees is usually the result of the rootstock. Not always, but usually is the result of the rootstock that it is put on. It's usually just like a runt of a rootstock. It's just like a weak, sickly kind of rootstock. And because of that, it can't provide enough energy for the top to get big, and so it stays smaller. And so like fully dwarfed trees tend to not live as long because their roots are so weak. They very easily tip over in storms, and so they usually need to be staked like their whole life. And so I don't usually recommend fully dwarfed like apple trees or things like that. But if you want to do that, I would just stick with the same varieties that we recommend, like for semi-dwarf, and just find one that's fully dwarf. Like a dwarf enterprise is going to be just as delicious fruit, just as disease resistant as a semi-dwarf enterprise apple, for example. But you're just going to have to take care of it a little more. It's just going to be a little more sickly. You're going to need to stake it for its whole life so it doesn't fall over. There are a couple trees that are naturally dwarfs, like that are genetic dwarfs, that are less sickly because it's just a genetic thing with them. It's not a rootstock induced thing. I don't know of any like apples or pears or peaches that are really like that, other than like the patio peaches are like that, but the fruit is usually not real great. But some people like them. But there's a cherry, I think it's called North Star, or Evans. Oh no, I can't remember. It's either Evans or North Star. That's like a genetic dwarf cherry tree that does pretty well. And then there's a mulberry that I really like called Geraldi or Gerardi. It's spelled both ways, even though it's a completely different name. That's a great mulberry that only gets like 6 feet tall. And then I like shrubs. So like for cherries, I like bush cherries, like that they're not dwarf trees, they're shrubs, but they produce cherries like the tree. But yeah, otherwise in terms of like cultivars for a dwarf tree, I just say just stick with the same cultivars and then just pick a dwarfing rootstock, which usually you'll find on most good nurseries. When spacing branches, does it have to, or can you be done when the tree is young? I think maybe there's a word missing there. I'm not sure what that is referring to. So yeah, if you if you missed a word in there, if you want to go back and update that, I will answer that. Something about spacing branches. Um, next one, for blackberries, is there a minimum height for tip pruning? Also, do they grow bigger during their floricane year or no? There is not a minimum height for tip pruning. I mean, you want it to be I mean, like usually like 5 or 6 feet is what I recommend, just because like if you tip pruned at like, I don't know, 2 or 3 feet tall or something like that, the side branches are going to get really long, and then you're going to end up with the same kind of tangle. And so it's usually nicer to have them just a little taller, and then it also kind of keeps the branches out of the weeds. But I guess theoretically there is no height limit. You could do it pretty short, and see what it does. Oh yeah, this is a great question. Should you cut the fire blight off as soon as it appears in the spring / early summer, or wait till late summer? Absolutely, as soon as you see it, cut it out. I just like to mention it in this class because sometimes people don't know or they forget, and this is like a time to put on your calendar. But absolutely, what you should be doing is checking your trees on a regular basis, just observing your trees, watering them, checking for pests, whatever. And anytime you see fire blight, it does not matter the time of the year, cut it out, get rid of it. When is the best time to transplant blackberries? They pop up everywhere around my main bush. They're pretty indestructible. You can really kind of do it whenever. But like with all perennials, I mean, the best time is either like, fall or early spring, because it's easier, like right now in the middle of summer when it's really hot and dry, you probably could transplant a blackberry, but they'd be more likely to die just because it's a much more stressful time of the year. I would also say, like, if them propagating themselves is a problem, that's also where having the trellis and pruning can help, because blackberries, although raspberries in particular will root. Like if the branch gets really long and it touches the end where it touches, it'll root and start a new plant. And so keeping them kind of pruned and up on a trellis will help prevent them from like spreading all over. But yeah, you can dig them up, just like you would any other perennial. My favorite time is late fall for really all perennials, just because our falls tend to be more predictably mild. Although the length of the fall is unpredictable, it's usually pretty predictably mild, and then it goes into cool. Whereas the spring, it's hard to judge. Like, if you do it in May, we might have a whole nother month of decent weather, or it might be 100 degrees for the next 4 months. You just never know. Will we be able to rewatch this seminar? Yes, I forgot to mention that. The recording I will post onto YouTube, and I will send out an email when I have that